Welcome. Super excited to have you all here today. I see some new faces, I see some familiar faces. What I'd first like to ask you to do is to put your name, your company, and your location in the chat. It's a great way for us to know who is all here and participating. I'll introduce myself on camera. My name is Anna Stephanie. I'm Executive Director of famtech.org. We're the hosts of this awesome program today. We are an industry association for those who may be interacting with us for the first time. That means we are a nonprofit that have for-profit member companies as long as we're advancing the industry as a whole. And our industry is the care economy. We're supporting innovators and investors across this ecosystem. This is just one of the events that we do. We're thrilled to have Lauren Dai, our entrepreneur in residence, sharing all this fantastic knowledge with you here today. Later on, we're going to put our Luma calendar link in the chat, which you can go to see other types of events that we do. We do both in-person and virtual events. And if you're interested in joining FamTech, check us out at famtech.org/join us. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Hi, everyone. It always takes me a minute to figure out where my unmute button is. It's so good to see you. Lots of familiar faces and some new ones, as well as Anna mentioned. So I want to just quickly introduce myself and the boot camp on Are We There Yet? For those of you who weren't with us last time around. And first of all, I am, as Anna mentioned, our entrepreneur in residence at famtech.org. And my experience is actually as a founder, just like all of you, or many of you on the line. I know we have some industry leaders and revenue leaders too. And in addition to that, I am a mom of a 2-year-old. I have another one on the way in May, so lots going on. But my goal is really to give back the knowledge and expertise from growing Cocoon, my startup, to our first couple million in revenue, to all of you. We are going to focus today on user interviews. And I call user interviews our edge for early customers because a lot of times there's this misconception to a certain extent that building value for customers, whether that's parents, whether that's caregivers, whether that's the elderly, for example, actually relies on the build being the number one most important thing, like deploying code, right? And the reality is, you really do not want to be doing that before you have a strong point of view on some of the big startup questions that we talked about last week, such as what even is your wedge or your product kind of edge into the market, right? Who even should be your early adopter, right? Should you even be selling to employers B2B versus B2C? Some of these big questions. So, building off of last week, we're going to really talk about today a couple of really, really fun tools in terms of how to leverage user interviews to develop a strong point of view on these big questions. Before you even build anything, deploy any code, even develop prototypes, for example. And then from there, we'll make sure we have enough time for Q&A this time. I know last time was a bit rushed, so hopefully we'll be a little bit more on time this time. And we'll have some breakout time for networking, which we'll talk about. And we'll come back as a group to wrap up and share some learnings from the week.
And just a reminder, Lauren, if they have questions, they can place them in the chat throughout the content.
Exactly. Yes. And that is the perfect tee up for quick recap on how to get the most out of this series. So again, this is an opt-in or opt-out to join for topics that really matter to you based on where you are, stage of company, all of that. We do want you to be really engaged. So definitely drop Q&A in the chat throughout. We do have that dedicated Q&A time, which we'll use to answer questions that come in. And also new and exciting, thank you to our community members who suggested this, is an office hours that we're doing. So in our FamTech Slack community, we will be collecting Wednesdays and Thursdays Q&A in an office hours Slack thread in our Are We There Yet bootcamp Slack thread. And I will post a video answering questions by theme on Fridays. All right. With that, let us dive in. So For those of you who weren't here with us last week, just again, quick recap. We were talking about how to answer some of these big questions like who's your early adopter? This is all about sort of, later sessions are all a lot about sales, like selling into employers, for example. And so there's big questions such as, should you even do that? Right. And for anyone who missed last week, just so you know, videos are being posted on our FamTech Events YouTube channel. So check that out. And this week, again, we're going to talk about what are these tools from a user interview standpoint to actually develop a strong point of view on these big questions. So from there, let's actually go into some of these really, really big tips via a case study, my perfect or my favorite way to share learnings. Now, given my experience building Cocoon over the past 5 years, it's very natural to use Cocoon as a case study. And I happen to have a lot of real life examples from that. So that makes it nice and fun from that perspective, too. Many people don't realize that when you are starting a company, oftentimes the thing that you thought you were going to build is extraordinarily different from what you actually end up building and selling. And your customer could be completely different in a lot of ways too. So that story was very true for Cocoon. One of the initial ideas that we had for Cocoon was actually financial wellness for parents, so more of a consumer-facing app, for instance. And a lot of it came from our own experience as founders, being about to be parents ourselves, and also our backgrounds in fintech from Stripe and Square. And that idea, however, evolved massively, as you will see, throughout the experience of doing user interviews largely, because we learned more and more about the pain points of the user, of one of the users, parents, for example, that we are building for, and also the ecosystem around those pain points. So just to kind of give you an example, one of the things that we heard from parents early on as we were interviewing them was, wow, yes, all these things like saving for college in 529s, figuring out wills, life insurance, all of that is very complicated. However, right now, the hair on fire burning thing is I actually have not been paid yet from my leave. And so as we were talking to these parents through user interviews, we were like, oh, double click, what's going on there? Tell us more. And that's how we figured out, okay, maybe there's an early kind of product here that's like a TurboTax for leave, right? So that was one sort of like evolution of our idea. And then we started thinking about questions like, hmm, well, if we're focusing on TurboTax for leave being the first product, do we want to go to the consumer, sell to consumers, right? In the way that TurboTax does today, right? Anyone doing their taxes right now? I am. Um, or do we want to go B2B through the employer, right? Because there's actually this whole ecosystem around leave that we started learning about through user interviews. And then if we're going to go to the employer, sell to the employer, right? What type of employer should we be selling to? Who is our early adopter, the one who is going to buy us without much product surface area and functionality, to be honest, and no existing customers or logos, right? Who's going to be that take that leap of faith on a startup, right? Who's our ideal customer profile to start, or ICP? And then other questions like, how do we get in? Like, what is going to be that aha product wedge that makes these employers excited about us, right? So all of that is an example of one, how your idea and who you sell to can evolve massively through your learnings through user interviews, and just how much you can gain from taking this upfront step before doing anything like building product, trying to sell, anything like that. Okay, so let's go into just the quick highlights on Cocoon as a sample case study. And we briefly touched on this last time as I was flying through this, but the key here is really that learning velocity is the most important thing in startups. especially when I talk to founders who are, for example, at the pre-seed stage, for instance, pre-seed seed stage, the number one thing for you, and frankly, that you want to demonstrate to investors who might be interested in funding you, is that you are learning at an unbelievable rate, right? And user interviews are going to be what helps you do that. So with Cocoon, for instance, we did 133 interviews across two different constituencies, actually more, but the primary two groups were parents and HR folks who we later kind of added in to the interview group as we learned more that there was more of an ecosystem around leave and HR might be really, really closely involved. And so what it kind of comes down to is you want to be setting yourself a benchmark of let's make sure we're getting in 2 to 3 interviews at least per day. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the tips for how to do that and also what doing user interviews effectively looks like. I'm going to share kind of off the bat a couple of key tips for how to make sure your user interviews are incredibly effective for answering some of these big questions from a startup perspective, such as who is the early adopter for your product, right? So first tip is, or tool, is you really want to go wide before you go narrow. So for those of you who might come from a design background, you may be familiar with the design thinking process called the double diamond, where you start out discovering by going wide, right? And so maybe you have a hypothesis that the early adopters of your product are going to be high income parents, right? However, you actually want to go way wider than that to start so that you can discover more about what you don't know, right? It might turn out that actually middle income parents are better adopters because of X, Y, and Z reason, right? Um, Using kind of like an example from Cocoon's experience. And what we did for Cocoon is we actually kind of itemized out, as you can see in this user interview tracker, what type of interview we wanted to conduct. And you can see that we had a pretty diverse range of both parents that we interviewed and employers that we interviewed, right? And in many cases, this went beyond our network, right? So our network was we came from startups, from tech, had a lot of connections into tech employers, but we wanted to make sure we were interviewing a very wide range of employers like, for example, utilities like PG&E, for instance, in here in California, or employers that are, for example, we interviewed a local pizza parlor as an example to understand what leave working in a pizza shop was like. And so that really helps you. You really want to be going wide because you want to develop conviction on how are these different potential markets or buyers different or similar from each other? And how does that help me develop my point of view on who I should be going after first? Make sense? Okay. So, tool number 2. Many of you may be asking, how do you even get 130 something interviews in such a short time period? Well, you want to get really scrappy on how you get intros and also don't be afraid to pay for their time because people's time is valuable. So if you think it's going to help to compensate them for it, do it. So using Cocoon as an example, we started out with a lot of just our existing network, right? So when we're talking to parents, we're talking to parents who we work with, for instance, like colleagues of mine at Stripe, maybe colleagues of my co-founder at Square, for instance, other people, family members, cousins, like whoever we could really reach out to there. Similarly, for reaching out to employers, right? So my favorite example of an employer that we interviewed is we interviewed my husband's cousin's HR person. So, things start to there are a couple leaps eventually that get you to these people, but there might be second cousins involved and so forth. But whole point is you want to get really scrappy, like literally mine your entire network, every friend, family member, former colleague, etc., to get an intro to the target person that you're trying to get intro to. And don't even worry about getting the exact person, right? You may not even know yet who the title is, right? Should you be talking to a head of people? Should you be talking to an HRB business partner? We'll talk more about these terms in the selling into HR session that's coming up. But the point being here is you really, really want to get scrappy on how you get those intros. And another interesting kind of anecdote is with Cocoon, we noticed that we had some gaps in our networks that we needed to fill out. And so we actually decided to post on Craigslist to get some interviews with folks who we wouldn't otherwise know. So, for instance, we were really interested in interviewing people of very diverse backgrounds about their experience with leave. We interviewed a lot of parents who worked at tech companies, but we wanted to interview parents who were construction workers, who were dental assistants, for example. And so, actually, what we did is we just put together a quick post on Craigslist and offered $30 for a 1 hour phone call to really chat about their experience, and ended up getting some really, really fascinating, high quality interviews just from that experience alone. Now, you also get some spam. There was someone who told me they had 12 kids, and I was like, I think this person is spamming me. So you got to filter a little bit, but point being, get scrappy, and there's some fun ways to get some of these interviews together. Okay. So let me just make sure that, yes, Megan, great. Craigslist, and thank you, Anna, for posting on the ICP. I'm just trying to check the chat periodically so that we can make sure to incorporate. All right, let's move on to user interview tool number 3. So one of the big things that sometimes folks forget to start with is actually spelling out your research goals. Now, it sounds so incredibly basic, but I have seen so many people jump into user interviews and just start asking questions without remembering exactly what question they're trying to answer ultimately. And so you want to go back to, hey, what are those big questions I'm trying to answer, right? Like, for example, am I selling B2B, B2C? Am I like, who is my early adopter, right? Like, is it going to be an employer who's a tech company, an employer who is a healthcare company? Who's it going to be, right? So spell out your goals ahead of time. You can see that a really good way to do this, including some examples from our experience at Cocoon, is to develop a guide in order to test your hypotheses. And so for both constituencies, so to speak, for parents and also HR folks who we started interviewing, once we started to understand the ecosystem around the employer, we created separate interview guides with upfront research goals and the key questions that we wanted to answer as part of that. So definitely take the time to do that. And actually, one of the things we're going to do as part of our breakout in a little bit is to workshop with each other on what your goals are when it comes to user interviews. Okay. So next tool is, last time around, we got a question around, okay, if you're doing user interviews, do you want to do them with your co-founder, for example, or other leaders on the team, right? And the answer is absolutely yes. Like, do not do user interviews by yourself. You really want to be collaborating, being on every interview to the extent possible with your co-founder in particular, or co-founders in particular, because you need to be on the same page as far as what you're learning and the decision points that come out of that, right? Because if one person is hearing that, it is very different hearing it secondhand from your co-founder than hearing it firsthand directly from the mouth of the horse, right? Or the user, as they say. So, and it's also really fun doing user interviews together. When my co-founder and I were doing this, we found it to be really fun co-founder dating as well, just to get to know each other. How is it like to work with each other? If you're maybe friends but haven't like worked together recently, for example, which was the case for us. And it's also really worthwhile to make sure you have a system to synthesize learnings regularly. So what I mean by that is, very likely the questions you had when you started your user interview process are not going to be the same questions that you have partway through the user interview process, right? As an example, partway through interview parents, we were like, wait a minute, we got to be interviewing HR people because they're the ones who are the ones who kind of like are really involved in the leave from a compliance perspective, from a benefits perspective when it comes to insurance, for example, and so forth. And so you really want to be evolving how you think about it, right? And that means iterating on the prior tip of goals and the actual guide itself. You can see that we took 316 pages of notes on our interviews with parents and 524 pages of notes on our interviews with HR teams. I mean, that is kind of like a wild amount of note taking. These days, AI can help you with that, so save you some typing. But the point being, like, literally, if you open these Google Docs for us, the Google will struggle, your internet will struggle to load these docs. There's so much information in them, right? Because you're learning so much from these interviews every single day. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a taste of what it's like to be doing these interviews, and especially with your co-founders or your team. Let's go to tool number 5. So as you start to do more and more of these interviews, right, you're going to get sharper and sharper on your key hypotheses. So as an example, when we started out with Cocoon, we started getting this signal that among all the financial issues that parents were experiencing, leave was something that was a really, really immediate pain point. And we also started getting some signal that, hey, people were really struggling with how to get paid from their leave, right? Because they were struggling with insurance, they were struggling with government, for example, and so forth. And as you get more and more concrete on your hypothesis for what is that very specific pain point that you're going to be tackling first, it's kind of like the aha moment for your user, or in some cases your buyer and user are the same, but um, that aha moment, right? Then you can actually start putting together product mocks or prototypes to get some feedback on areas like what is that product wedge, right? So, as an example, we started realizing that one of the hardest things for parents or people going on leave, what maybe you weren't a parent, but you taking a medical leave, for example, was to actually just get through their insurance forms, right? Whether it's MetLife or Guardian or California's EDD or Massachusetts paid family leave, et cetera. It was just very complicated. People didn't know how to do it. They weren't getting paid. And so we created some wireframes using Figma for an MVP product that we were calling kind of TurboTax for parents and HR teams for parental leave. And you can see that when I reached out to these HR folks to connect with them, that's the framing is like, hey, would love to get your early product feedback. Can we grab some time with you next week to walk through and walk you through, get your thoughts and also walk you through a quick flash of what this might look like and get your live input. And the really cool thing is that if you do these interviews over video chat, right, you'll actually be able to get so much more interesting feedback versus just doing it, let's say, over the phone or without camera on, right? Because, for example, if you're walking a customer or a potential customer or a buyer user through a Figma prototype, for instance, clickable prototype, right? Product mocks, you can actually see their facial expression and see, do their eyes literally go wide? Does their face just light up where they're like, whoa, that is super cool and valuable? That's really, really useful data for you beyond what they actually say verbally. So, hot tip, do your interviews on video as much as you possibly can.
Lauren, quick question from Steph from UZ. Do you have a particular hit rate that you remember with HR?
Steph, when you say hit rate, thank you for the question. Do you mean percent of HR folks who converted to saying yes to an interview?
Yeah, exactly. Like what was the conversion rate for them actually meeting with you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's been a while. Obviously, it's been 5 years since interviews were done, so, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. However, if I recall, the hit rate was very, very high, and I'll explain why. It was probably somewhere around the range of, like, I would say 80% of the folks who reached out to said yes, and then ultimately, maybe 70% of them actually scheduled an interview with us, and the reason the hit rate was really high was because essentially nearly all of our HR outreach was warm intros, meaning that we got like the husband's cousin to intro us to their HR person. Or in some cases, it was like my co founder's neighbor or my mom, for instance, right? So what I would say is your hit rate is really going to vary depending on whether they're warm intros or if you're reaching out cold. And I would start for sure with the warm ones. And part of the reason for that is A, just like time, but or hit rate to your point, but also B, the warm ones will intro you to more people, right? So like one thing we started doing is once we started with sort of like the people we were really tight with, right? So for example, the head of benefits at Stripe, who was my head of benefits when I was an employee at Stripe. And we asked her, hey, who else should we talk to, right? Who are your friends who lead benefits at other tech companies, right? And so that's another really great way to expand the circle of your warm intros.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so final tool is shadow your user on a research journey. And this applies a lot of times if you have a product that's attacking a certain workflow, for example, right? So, for instance, for Cocoon, the workflow would be leave management for an employer, like all the compliance they have to do, all the payroll they have to do, all the insurance forms they have to fill out, and that for the employee. So maybe they're a parent, for example, going on a parental leave for the first time, they have to understand what FMLA means, all these acronyms, right? They have to navigate complicated insurance forms, for example. What's really cool is beyond just doing, let's say, a 30-minute or 1 hour user interview, is to actually follow your user or your buyer through an entire cycle of their experience. You will be amazed how much you learn from that. So an example here is we did this thing that we called parent leave journeys with our folks that we interviewed. And um, what we would do was we kind of created this cohort of parents who were all pregnant, let's say, at the same time, and we just tracked their experience over the course of a number of months from when the kid was born, let's say, or if it was an adoption, they were placed, for instance, and beyond. They're navigating the experience of being on leave. And we had them very simply just check in with us via text once a week. And then some of them would opt in, for example, for more. So we would actually get on a Zoom call with them and shadow them struggling to navigate a disability insurance form with California EDD, as an example, right? And so super, super, super useful because you actually get to see live where your user or buyer is getting stuck or frustrated. Very, very valuable again, right? Bonus here is actually get your hands dirty and do it yourself and see where you get stuck. So I've got a lot of random California EDD accounts. Hopefully nobody audits me on that. Even before I took my own leave. And the reason for that was because I was actually just figuring out, like, okay, what's confusing for me? I have no idea what the term like, does your employer integrate pay is, right? So like, where do I get stuck? Or for instance, if I'm filling out insurance form with one of these private insurers, one of the things that always made me laugh, Anna, you might appreciate this too, is um, there's always a question of like, when did your symptoms first appear? Which is funny because you're like, if you're I'm currently pregnant, so this is also relevant. If you're having a child, it's like, actually I want you to fill out the date your child was born as opposed to when you started feeling nauseous, for instance. So anyway, point being, there's a lot of different friction points that your user or buyer are going to go through, and you're going to get a lot of high fidelity feedback by following them on the journey or doing it yourself. Get in the shoes of your buyer.
Okay, this is Victoria Nati from Akalaka. I'm just wondering, like, when you were going through your early stage and looking at how difficult the different forms were, like for government agencies and other insurance companies, I'm wondering, did you ever consider like your customer being the government agencies and the insurance companies, like to for them to buy like your improvement to their software or to their forms?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, the short answer is yes. We did consider whether there was an opportunity to actually, let's say, sell to insurance or sell to government agencies, let's say. But one of the things that we learned from user interviews is that there are going to be certain types of buyers who are going to be early adopters of new technology and certain types that are going to be more conservative. And in general, what we found is that insurance companies, for example, or government agencies are going to be quite conservative in their willingness to adopt new technology, especially when that technology is very limited in its scope, right? So I'll give you an example. When we started with Cocoon, our very first customer, Carta, they only were using us for parental leave of the many, many, many regulated leave types, and only in two states, California and Utah, where they happen to have a lot of their employees. Now, very few insurance companies, essentially none, or government agencies are likely going to be willing to adopt something so, so narrow, right? And so you really have to think a lot about who is going to be, back to kind of week one, your early adopter, and be willing to take a risk for some big benefit, like, wow, ease of getting paid or ease of navigating these complicated forms, right? But the shortcoming that they're willing to deal with is a very limited, narrow product, because you're not going to build the whole thing kind of overnight, right? Does that
Right.
resonate?
Okay. Yes, that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm curious, have you kind of thought about the roadmap for Cocoon, like to eventually, I guess, once you scale with the early adopters, to then sell directly to the middle people or the middle agents?
Yeah, yeah. Such a great question, Victoria. So absolutely. And that is the reason why one of our future sessions is actually about scaling through channel, right? So for Cocoon, just quick kind of 30 seconds on our journey was we started selling into HR, right? Being in specifically mid-market tech companies being our early adopter. And then over time, we would start layering on channels, for example, selling through brokers, right? And then selling through HRIS systems like ADP or Workday or Paylocity, for example, and then looking at other avenues like insurance, for example. So those are all things that as we've matured, we've started to do. But for the reasons that we talked about, as far as who is going to be your early adopter, we started with that sort of persona and buyer type that was going to be willing to take a risk on a very narrow product that solved a very specific pain point they were interested in, the wedge, right? But was limited in a lot of other ways.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. Okay, and we'll get a lot more into sequencing of your markets and so forth as we go forth in these sessions around selling into HR, then selling into brokers and other channels, for example, too. So you're absolutely spot on that question. Okay, so I want to actually kind of leave you all with a hot tip as we transition to our session for the content for next week, actually, which is around kind of starting to do sales, which is one of the cool things about user interviews is that when you're a startup, you have no brand, you have no customers, you have no legitimacy essentially at all. However, the cool thing about user interviews is you can start getting some pretty great quotes from folks about feedback on your product without even having done any sales. And you can start collecting those quotes now and putting them on, let's say, your website or your, one pager that you send out to folks that you eventually want to do sales with, right? So when we started doing sales, we just took quotes from our user interviews, like from Lindsay, who was our head of benefits at Stripe at the time. She had this amazing quote that we asked her to include, which she very generously allowed us to do. And it's these kinds of things that start to kind of help you bootstrap your own legitimacy and why people should be interested in a startup that literally maybe 3 women on their laptops, right? Or it's like you have no existing customers, but how do you start kind of building that flywheel? All right, so just a little hot tip there. And this is a fun example of an old Cocoon website, one of our original ones. Okay, so to recap from this week, we talked about leveraging user interviews to develop a strong point of view on some of these big startup questions, such as who's your early adopter, right? Back to Victoria's question, is it going to be government, insurance? Is it going to be HR? Is it going to be the consumer, right? Who do you go after first before you spend any money and effort building anything? We talked about the 6 user interview tools to help you be most effective, such as developing goals and a guide ahead of time. And then this is a really good kind of tee up for our content for next week, which is you might be asking the question of like, okay, so I'm doing these user interviews. When do I know I'm ready to do sales, right? The short answer, which we'll go more into next week, is you should know the answer to some of these big questions, meaning what is your wedge or your specific problem that you're solving that gets folks really excited, right? Who's going to be your early adopter, ideal customer profile? And then ideally, you've gotten some early feedback on a high fidelity prototype. Okay. So that is this week. And let's go actually to Q&A. I know a lot of folks, thank you to Steph and Victoria for jumping in with some questions during the session, and would love to open it up to folks to raise their hand for any additional questions that came up.
I have a question, if that's okay, Lauren.
Yes, please go.
And it might be out to the group, since both you and I did this a few years ago. I'm curious, has there been any emergence of customer interview technology that's AI enabled that kind of incorporates maybe some of the eye tracking or video transcribing or product insight extraction? Has anyone had experience or tips with some good user interview tools? Time for some research. I'm going to do a deep research prompt right now, and I'll come back to you.
I love that, Anna. I know a lot of the AI recording tools do really great summaries, for example, too. So for example, I know Zoom has one, Gong has one. I have a friend building this great one called Quill. So I'm sure folks have tried different examples there, but please jump in the chat or live if you have ones that you've tried.
And I'll give some research output next week, or not next week, in the following session.
Okay, perfect. I also love testing these questions on AI itself.
Exactly. Jason, you came off video. Do you have a question?
Sure, I'll ask one.
Great.
I have a question. No, like when you guys were going through and interviewing people, did you try to I mean, outside of your own network, did you try to go to like any like target companies and stuff, maybe through like LinkedIn or something to that extent?
Yeah, yes, we absolutely did, Jason. So for sure, we leveraged our network, but maybe to kind of spell it out a bit more systematically, we actually had a user interview tracker where we had targets for the number of user interviews we had per demographic line item. So for example, for parents, we had income brackets that we wanted to interview, right? And we wanted to interview, let's say, 8 parents in each income bracket. For employers, we had different segments. So SMB, mid-market, enterprise, for example, by employee headcount, industries, for instance, and we had targets for how many we want to interview. And so what we would do is we certainly sourced from our existing network, but we also would go, to your point, to LinkedIn, for instance, and see like, hey, okay, I really want to talk to someone who is connected to Starbucks, right? Like who might I know in that world who I could get an intro from, right? And so I would definitely be tracking the types, the go wide piece in terms of systematically who do you want to be interviewing in a way that allows you to fill in what you can from warm intros, but also kind of do the fill in the blanks via canvassing LinkedIn and other areas where you can get more data points on network.
Hey, Lauren, thank you for sharing all of these good
suggestions around interviews. I was curious if you also factored in any type of partner interviews. And by partners, I mean the channel partners that could be brokers, benefits consultants, those who are essentially influencing employer decisions, and how those factored into what you're finding from parents as well as HR.
Yes, great question. We absolutely did. We didn't do as many of them as we did with the actual kind of like buyer audience that we had initially kind of hypothesized, which was HR, but we absolutely interviewed brokers. So, for example, we interviewed some brokers who were at Sequoia, for instance, and so forth, ecosystem players, like other benefits. So for instance, I remember interviewing one of the co-founders of Clio, for instance. We interviewed the co-founders of Gusto, who actually eventually became angel investors in Cocoon. So just to get a sense of, hey, like what can we learn from you, Clio, or you, Gusto, and how you entered the market in a similar space, for example. So absolutely. I would definitely do that as well.
In those scenarios, did you find anything different or insightful in terms of the process of getting to the ultimate decision maker or buyer? Was that, or was it more reinforcing what you're already finding from employees and HR?
Yeah, I think maybe to kind of like use my personal experience as an example, what we learned was more so some of the challenges of the market that we were selling into. So, for instance, as we were interviewing other providers of benefits, for instance, Cocoon is a little bit of a benefit, but also mostly an admin tool in a lot of ways. One of the things we kept hearing was like, hey, you really want to be careful about adoption and utilization, as an example, right? Which is you might be able to sell into the employer, you might be able to sell into Google, but what percent of Google's employees are actually going to use your product? In a lot of cases, the challenge that some of these benefits have, I'm going to use mental health as an example, is low adoption. Maybe only 1% of people utilize the product, right? In which case,
Yeah.
perhaps the customer ends up churning after that, right? So we learned a lot of interesting tidbits like that that helped us structure our business model in a way that actually avoided a lot of that challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I know that Steph has a question. Steph, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to just hold your question for either async or afterwards in Slack, only because I know we're running a little bit low on time and I want to make sure folks have enough time for networking. But thank you everyone for all the really great questions. Okay, so let us go to just a quick call to action related to that. So on that note, I know there's a lot of questions out there that you all have that we didn't get to yet. Thank you, Steph, for raising your hand there. Please do join our members Slack channel for continuing the conversation, including office hours. And you can visit our famtech.org website to apply for membership. Okay, let's go to our breakout. So let's actually save 3 minutes at the end for a wrap up. So we'll come back at in about 10 minutes. Takia, if you can set up the breakout sessions. And I'm just going to introduce really quickly what the breakout session will be. So first, we're all starting to get to know each other still. So let's just intro yourself, your name, your company in one sentence on what your company does. And then we're going to take about 5 minutes just to really do some basic kind of groundwork here, which is start jotting down draft research goals for the big questions that you want to answer for your startup. So as an example, one question that Cocoon was, how do employers even make decisions around what benefits to buy versus not, right? And then have one group member share their goals and get some feedback before you all come back to the group. And then we'll wrap up together and get some learnings and insights. All right. I think we've got most folks back, or we're just starting to trickle folks back in from the breakout rooms. Thank you, Tina and Jenny, for letting me crash your breakout room. We were just chatting about being founder moms. Definitely a whole topic in and of itself. Actually, it is going to be a topic for our last session. Okay, awesome. So to wrap up today's session on user interviews, would love to get a volunteer or two to share what you're taking away from this week or what you're going to try doing, let's say this week as part of your process for, let's say, doing user interviews, if that's what you're up to right now. Any volunteers?
I'll just say that I just reached out to Nick on LinkedIn that I will absolutely help him with his research because I think I'm part of his target market. So
Okay.
Thank you,
That's
Jason.
awesome.
I'll follow up.
yep.
Cool. I love that. Yeah. It's all about part of the reason we do these breakout sessions is so that you can network, and getting user interviews from each other is a great idea. Any other takeaways, folks? Nick, maybe curious to get your perspective from the
Oh,
other
sure.
side.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little shy, but she got me. So, yeah. Well, I'm the founder of Kids Booked. It's an app to help parents find, plan, and manage summer camps specifically, but also teacher workday camps. And right now, I'm pretty sure that there is a need for it when I speak with the right people, but I'm having trouble getting to like a very succinct pitch that resonates. So I have some prototypes that I've shown to people. When they see the design, they say, "Oh, wow, this is great." But I think getting to like a pitch that has the same impact is would be helpful for me. So I think my hypothesis is it's valuable, but how do I, sell it more quickly?
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, that's a great tee up for our session next week, which is how do you leverage the learnings from your user interviews to formulate a very succinct value prop kind of especially as you're getting those first sales conversations. So great tee up. We'll come back to that very soon. And with that, I will say thank you and looking forward to seeing everyone at the next session.